Okay, so welcome everyone. This is my last opportunity in this series to talk to you about some insect pests, and we're starting off today with monitoring and managing seed corn maggot in onions and related crops. So the first question I have up for you here is, do you experience damage from seed corn maggot on an annual basis? This is one of those insects that if you encounter it, it probably gives you a headache, but some of you may be lucky enough to have never actually dealt with it. And it looks like most of you have been in the clear. Okay, I'll just give you a few. Well, I guess we can leave that poll open. So what is seed corn maggot? It's a fly. The adult looks a lot like a housefly. But the problem are the larvae. They infest young plants, newly planted seeds or germinating seeds or transplants. And they feed in or at the soil surface, which makes it difficult for us to monitor that activity and to also treat that activity after we experience damage. There are some lookalikes. That includes the cabbage and the onion maggot. Very similar flies and very closely related damage. And I actually already have a YouTube video prepared that I hope you can hear it. Let me know if you can't. I'm just going to share this video that is pretty comprehensive.
Laura, we cannot hear it.
Okay, how do I do this?
You share your screen at the beginning? You might have
to share sound. I see it.
There you go.
Thank you. Sorry. Let's try it again.
Hi, I'm Laura Ingwell, a specialty crops extension entomologist with Purdue University, and I'm here today at the Purdue Student Farm just off campus to talk to you about seed corn maggot and onion maggot. So I'm standing here in a field that was transplanted 10 days ago with some onion transplants. Prior to this year, the farm has not grown produce in this field.
Oh, what is happening?
About seed corn maggot and onion maggot. So I'm standing here in a field that was transplanted 10 days ago with some onion transplants. Prior to this year, the farm has not grown produce in this field. It was full of cover crops. And so prior to planting this year, there was a little bit of cultivation and mixing in of that organic matter. But we were surprised to find that within 6 days of transplanting, we saw some severe damage. Onion maggot and seed corn maggot are two very closely related species, both belonging to the genus Delia. The adults resemble houseflies. In our region, the flies survive as pupae over winter in the soil. And when spring comes and that soil begins to warm and we accumulate growing degree days for the flies, they will eventually emerge from that soil and locate suitable host plants to oviposit and lay their eggs on. Things that are particularly attractive to these flies are high levels of organic matter in the soil. They can cue in on the smells associated with organic decomposition and find those as a suitable place to lay eggs. So some of the factors that are contributing to the infestations that we're seeing in this field include that high organic matter in the soil, which we're aiming for good, healthy crop production, and also the fluctuations in the weather that we're experiencing. So right now it is the first week of May. We have seen some days in the 70s and 80s in Fahrenheit. But more typically, it's been sort of a cool, wet spring with warm days scattered in here and there. So in that situation, the larvae and the eggs of these flies will thrive in that cool soil. There are a variety of factors that could contribute to wilting, especially shortly after transplanting. For instance, these onions came out of the greenhouse. They didn't have much time to harden off. So we were anticipating a little bit of a transplant shock, a little bit of wilting in the onions. But when that wilting was so severe, we decided to investigate and go down a little further and see what was happening to these transplants. What we often want to do is dig up the soil around that and be able to investigate the root and the base of the plant and look for any suspected damage. So they start out as eggs in the soil, and as those eggs hatch, they burrow down, they feed on the roots, and then they move up into the onion and the plant material itself. When we have young transplants like this, they're very susceptible, and this type of maggot feeding will lead to plant death. As we get bigger and more vigorous plants later in the season, onions can generally tolerate this type of feeding, but you may see some aesthetic damage or deformation on the bulb, but the plants themselves will survive. The onion maggot species is fairly specific in its host range and specializes on feeding on alliums. So that does include onions and garlic and other allium crops. However, the seed corn maggot has a much broader host range, and you can find that oftentimes feeding on corn and moving into allium and onion crops where we see a bit of overlap. In Indiana, we often hear about seed corn maggot affecting untreated sweet corn that's planted and young melon transplants in the field. When we have cool, wet springs, we can see damage from that. There are a few different cultural strategies that we can implement to minimize the amount of damage caused by these maggot seed feeders. One of those revolves around organic matter, which is a bit conflicting because we want to increase organic matter in our fields. So some of the others include monitoring the development of the insects themselves and delaying our planting times so that we miss the peak emergence and flight of the adults in the spring. So we can do this by tracking the development days over 40 degrees at which the flies are accumulating and developing in the soil, and we can delay our planting or our transplanting to miss that. If you have a fairly small farm, you could plant early but use a protective cover over those young transplants to block the flies from being able to oviposit on those young plants. The flies themselves have 3 to 4 generations per year, but like I mentioned earlier, as the crops get older and bigger, they can tolerate that damage much better than young transplants, which are the most susceptible and can become killed. The most efficacious way to control these pests is through the application of seed treatments. So this is applying an insecticide to the outside coating of the seed, and when that seed is directly transplanted into the ground, the chemical moves into the growing tissues. And therefore, when you have a newly emerging seed that's very attractive to the seed-feeding maggots, it's protected by that insecticide. However, that strategy has to be used prior to any sort of monitoring to see if the flies and the pests are going to be there. So an alternative way to use chemical control is to do in-furrow drenches. So this is a similar mode where you put the chemical in the furrow in the line when you're transplanting, and the chemical is systemic and moves into the plant at that time and protects that young tissue. But again, you usually have to make that determination at the time of transplant, but looking at the accumulation of degree days can help you predict the abundance or emergence of flies in relation to when you're planting those seedlings. Foliar applications are not efficacious as this insect is underground and in the roots and in the soil, and it is not efficacious to try to treat the adults. So really we have to be preemptive in our management strategies and monitor and think about crop placement and crop timing to minimize the damage from these pests.
Okay, so just highlighting and reviewing some of the points in that video. Seed corn maggot fly behavior is really predictable. We know that females are looking for the best place to oviposit their legs, and what that means is that they have learned to cue in on this smell of organic or decaying matter. And then they lay their eggs, if the plant isn't there yet, if you have not yet transplanted, just in the cracks in the soil or under soil clods at the base of new transplants. So one way that you can reduce the risk of your crop being infested is make sure that you till under work in that organic matter at least 2 weeks prior prior to transplanting. So that gives you a 2-week window for much of that early decay to take place, and hopefully some of that smell is gone and that field is less attractive to those females. Again, you can expect to find them in fields that have a history of infestations, or places where you maybe were growing field crops that have not been treated. In an area with high fresh organic matter, and that can include manure, cover crops, or weeds that have been recently tilled, because that recent disturbance of the soil sort of releases that smell and creates those cracks where the flies can lay their eggs. And again, in cool, wet soils. So what you can do to avoid them. So one strategy is to delay planting just until soil conditions are favorable, so that those young seeds germinate and grow really quickly and can sort of outgrow some of that damage that may be imparted by the flies, or monitoring the development of those flies and waiting until the degree day models, so until the peak abundance of flies have emerged in your area and they have laid their eggs. And if you go in after that, you can avoid the likelihood of them finding your crop and laying their eggs and damaging your crop. And again, like I said, trying to delay that planting, or maybe getting in and tilling a little earlier, so that you have at least 2 weeks for that organic matter to be incorporated and decompose in the soil. But again, a lot of that's going to be reliant on the temperature as well, right? If it's really, really cold, that decomposition may not happen in that 2-week window. If you are interested in using pesticides to control this pest, you can go to the guide. And I just want to walk you through that. So in this case, we would look at onions. And if you type under pest, just maggot, what you're going to find here is information again about monitoring the peak emergence and oviposition. And when you get down to pesticides, you'll notice here that most of them are seed treatments or chemicals that can be applied in furrow at planting. So again, there are no foliar sort of rescue applications that you can use. If you have a really high infestation and it's a really large value crop, likely starting over, removing that crop and planting a week later after those maggots have left or dried out because of no food is going to be your best bet to recover something. So the last question that I wanted to ask in this poll relates to that tracking or monitoring of the insect development. So I think that Rachel has to, yep, there it is. So what I'm asking you here is, would you like Purdue Extension Entomology to provide you with a degree day calculator to monitor the development and emergence of this pest? The University of Wisconsin has one, and if you're in northern Indiana, you can use that tool, but it doesn't make it quite far enough south for most of the state. And lastly, I wanted to draw your attention to, again, these resources and say thank you. And if you have any questions, I would love to take those. But otherwise, you can navigate to that video on this webpage here, our vegetable website, where you see the icon for the YouTube playlist. Thank you.
Thank you. If you have any questions, be sure you can type them in the chat and we can get those answered about anything about seed corn maggot or any other pests there.
Phil, can I ask one in person?
Yes, Petrus.
So what was interesting, I did do some weight measurements. I did some yield measurements on those onions, and it seemed like some varieties were more affected than others. And I don't know if it's entirely true, but I mean, they were all planted in the same area. And we went from anywhere about 80,000 pounds to the acre to down to 50,000 pounds to the acre on certain varieties that were affected. And you can really see it in the stand while they were growing. So I wonder if there's something there that needs to be investigated. I don't know.
I would say there likely is. So that's one of the big gaps when it comes to specialty crops and insects. We have good information about variety performance for pathogens, but oftentimes not for insects. And what I have seen is that if you really look at variety selection, you can often find variation in the susceptibility of particular varieties. So that would be really cool to tease apart, Petrus, and see which ones were more susceptible. Thank you.
We have a question here. Did you notice a difference in cover crop? So maybe different species of cover crop, I think he might be asking about. Whether that attracted more than other one?
Not necessarily. So I think at the farm here, it was a lot of clover and ryegrass maybe, but it's not the growing crop itself, it's that decomposition process. So it's really that rotting organic matter that's attractive to the flies. So it's kind of a broad, it can be manure, it can be weeds in the field that are rotting. I have not seen any work that would show one crop in particular that would potentially deter them. And Petrus put the yield information in the chat, which is really interesting. Thank you, Petrus.
All right. Looks like we don't have any more questions now, but you can still type them in. We can get back to them later if you have any more that come up. So we'll move on to our next topic, still on insects, caterpillars and other insect pests on cole and kale crops. Again, we have Laura Ingwell and also Dr. Elizabeth Long co-presenting this topic here. So we'll get started then.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Okay, this is great, a great starter question while I get my slides up and share my screen with you. Very excited to talk with you all about caterpillars and other insect pests on cole crops, partly because being at home in the pandemic this past year, we had way more greens in our garden and we got slammed by caterpillars. So I've learned some things through struggling. Okay, sorry, let me get my screen shared here. I think this is the right one, share. Okay, and if I make this large, oops, slideshow. Can you see that okay, Phil?
Doesn't look like you haven't started the slideshow yet.
Oh, okay. I am screen sharing, let's see. Oh, I see what's happening. I have two screens. Oh, geez. Okay, I can do this. Let me share a different screen. Maybe that's what's happening. Sorry, bear with me. Where did my Zoom window go? Okay, let me stop share and switch. Sorry, I have two screens here and I normally don't. I should have been prepared. Share. Let me try this screen instead. Okay, did that make a difference? Hang on, slideshow. Can you see it now? Still not? Well, this is not ideal.
We're seeing this your PowerPoint, but not like the presentation. So it's just like the regular editing thing there.
Oh, Laura's coming in to help me. Hang on, the door's locked. Thank you. Okay, Laura saved the day. Are we good? Okay,
That's
sweating
good.
bullets there. Totally spilled my drink, but we're good. We're good. Okay. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. Okay, I'm just going to get started. Hopefully you all had a chance to answer that poll. Oh, let me switch my pointer here so that you can see it. Oh, wait. Laser pointer. Okay, so I didn't have a chance to see the answers to the poll because I was all flustered. So I don't know which pests are most problematic, but I'm guessing caterpillars are one of the top ones that many of you struggle with. Okay, 73% of you say caterpillars. Good to know. I'm very interested in the others as well. Okay, so today, very quickly, I'm going to do a very general overview of caterpillars, flea beetles, and thrips, which I'm going to guess for many of you go into too much about their life cycle biology because there's just not that much time. So following that, I'm going to focus on helpful resources for managing these insect pests. And then if I have time, give some examples from the vegetable production guide. Fortunately, Laura shared an example with you already, so hopefully you're all familiar with that resource. And then also the Purdue Plant Pest Diagnostic Laboratory, because that can be really helpful for submitting samples, particularly of caterpillars and flea beetles to us, so we can help you identify if that's indeed what you have, or if it's an actual pest. Okay, why is it not advancing? Okay, so we've already done the first poll question, so we're just going to skip through that. And the first group I'll talk about are the caterpillars. And as many of you seem to already know, these are the primary pests to manage on your cruciferous crops. So this includes broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, arugula, collard greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, all the delicious stuff that you love. These caterpillars love to eat it too. And if you don't stay ahead of these caterpillars, they will totally devastate your crop. So the main reason caterpillars are a key problem, and many of you know this, is that they feed on the leaves and the heads of developing cruciferous crops. And depending on the crop, leaf damage may or may not be that big a deal. Often the feeding on the heads can be a big issue. So taken together, the feeding by these caterpillars obviously reduces plant growth. You have these large feeding holes in the parts of the plants that you're trying to sell or market. And caterpillars produce lots of crop fouling frass. They're solid waste or droppings. And not only are those all over the plants and unsightly, they can actually, their frass can also stain produce. So quickly today, I want to focus on let's say the four most very hungry caterpillars that you're likely seeing in your own fields or even in a backyard garden or even an urban garden. And these are the cabbage looper, the imported cabbage worm, the cross-striped cabbage worm, and the diamondback moth. So we grew some collards in our garden this past year. I mentioned that earlier. And this is not a picture from our garden, but if anyone has seen this damage, you typically immediately think it's a caterpillar because these are large holes. They're consuming a lot of material. And in fact, there is a caterpillar right there, busted in the act. Okay, so I'll start with the cabbage looper, and one of the reasons I want to emphasize this caterpillar first is because it is very voracious. You know, there's some estimation out there that they feed or remove more plant tissue than any of the other caterpillars, and they get pretty large in size. Here's a mature final stage of the caterpillar. They can be roughly 1.5 inches in length, so plenty large, you're not going to miss them. They're light green, and you can kind of see with this earlier stage caterpillar, they have this white stripe on each side of the body. And they're typically a problem later in the season. For those of you who are not caterpillar experts though, or if you're creeped out by the caterpillars, which is understandable, one of the easiest ways, oh, let me back up. There's that nice white stripe you can see on the side of the body, and they have a very distinctive crawling behavior. So if you see a caterpillar on your plant and it's doing this kind of arching its back and forming a loop, which is why it's called the cabbage looper, that is likely what you have. So they kind of form this loop and it looks like they throw the front of their body forward as they're walking. The next one I want to emphasize is the imported cabbage worm. Not that it's a competition, but they also are up there in terms of how much plant tissue they can remove when they're feeding. And these caterpillars look pretty different. I think it's the only one you're going to see on your cruciferous crops that has this appearance. They look kind of fuzzy or velvety. You can see that very clearly in this nice image. Some might argue they're slug-like in appearance. They have this yellow stripe down the back of the body. They also have a yellow stripe on either side of the body. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, and it's not always present on smaller stage caterpillars. But if it's fuzzy and has this yellow stripe down the back, it's likely an imported cabbage worm. They're also pretty good in size, or pretty large, roughly 1.25 inches long. So you can see the damage here. They've removed a lot of tissue from this leaf. The next caterpillar I'll mention is the cross-striped cabbage worm. And need I say more? This is a bright, showy caterpillar that nothing else really looks like of the 4 species that I'm going to talk about today. So they have this light kind of bluish gray coloring on their back, all these stripes that are black or white if you're focused on the white parts. They have this very bright yellow coloring on the sides of the body. And when they're mature, they're about 3/4 of an inch long, so very easily visible. And again, can remove quite a bit of tissue from your plants. These are just a couple of examples I want to give from my own experience that is diagnostic for this caterpillar. The adults lay these masses of eggs on the underside of leaves, and this is on a collared plant. And if you see these little patches, these are the egg masses of the cross-striped cabbage worm. The other caterpillars, the adult moths of the other caterpillars lay eggs singly, or only 1 or 2 or 3 in a group, and they look very different. This is actually a photo of an arugula plant from my own garden last summer. And you can see these are actually, by rearing them out and letting them destroy my plants, only one, I was able to figure out that these are actually cross-striped cabbage worms. But I just want to emphasize here that when they're tiny, other caterpillars too, they may look quite different from the mature caterpillars. So this is when it might be helpful to submit a sample to the Purdue Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab. And I'll talk more about that at the end. The last caterpillar I'll talk about is the diamondback moth. Of all the caterpillar species, this one is going to be the smallest. It has this kind of greenish yellow body, again, 1/3 of an inch, pretty small, and a quick and easy way to diagnose this insect on your plant. Typically, if you poke them or disturb them, they'll wiggle and thrash a lot. They'll throw themselves off the plant and often dangle there from a piece of silk thread. And so they'll hang there until they feel the danger is past, and then they'll crawl back up and start feeding again. So if you see a caterpillar hanging out on one of your cruciferous crops, Christmas tree ornament style, it is definitely the diamondback moth. The next group I want to talk about are the flea beetles. And generally, they're not very hard to control, as I have here, but they can cause a lot of injury by the time you realize that they're actually present, because they're so small and feed on the underside of leaves. You may not see them until they're, exploding. So they're a common early season pest. They're called flea beetles because the adults have these enlarged hind legs. You can kind of see that a little bit here in this flea beetle. And so they jump when they are disturbed, but they're also very capable of flight. So the flea beetle thing is just, jumping behavior with the enlarged hind femora. The damage of these beetles is unique and is going to look very different from the damage of a caterpillar. These are going to be small holes, less than 1/8 of an inch in size. So very small holes that are chewed into the surface layer of leaves. So it may not be a true hole that you can actually see through on the plant. It may be more like a kind of skeletonized or window painting feeding. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide. And I just want to emphasize here that generally speaking, cruciferous crops are most susceptible to damage by flea beetles when they're at the seedling stage. So here is a classic example of flea beetle damage. You can see several, these are crucifer flea beetles feeding. And here you can see that feeding damage. There's a lot of holes kind of close together here. Not all of them, though, are actual true holes, right? They're kind of feeding from the top layer, and there's kind of a little layer, thin layer of leaf tissue remaining. Some describe this feeding damage as shot holes, but yeah, well, I guess there's some here that have holes all the way through, but this kind of window pane feeding or shot holing is diagnostic for the flea beetle on cruciferous crops. I won't talk about any of the different flea beetles, or I don't suspect even myself to be able to go out there and be sure which one is which, as if you have a bunch of them on your plant. But just to emphasize here on this slide, there are many different species of the flea beetle, and the key ones that are going to be feeding on your crucifer crops are the ones I have pictured here. So the crucifer flea beetle, the striped flea beetle, the pale striped flea beetle, and the red-headed flea beetle. The last insect I'll mention is thrips. And these can be important pests of mainly cabbage, particularly in hot, dry weather. So these insects are very, very small. I suspect many of you are familiar with thrips if in your garden, whether they're on peppers or tomatoes. Generally speaking, on cabbage, it's going to be the onion thrips, sometimes western flower thrips that are feeding and causing damage. And the thrips actually have a unique feeding strategy. They have these piercing, sucking, rasping mouth parts. So they take their mouths, which are kind of like an inverted, imagine sticking an ice cream cone on your face and dragging that across a leaf surface. And that's how they're feeding. That's what their mouth parts kind of look like. So they're dragging and physically damaging the cells, and they're slurping up the contents of those cells in the process, or after they bust them open with the rasping. And so this feeding causes this bronzing or speckling appearance on the heads of cabbage. And they can also cause a response where the tissue, as it heals, it gets rough. And so these cabbages then become less marketable. This damage can reduce yields, but again, most of the concern is the cosmetic damage. And if you slice these cabbages open, you can actually see that damage on the inside of the cabbages. So inside of the cabbage heads, so if they don't look that great, it may be really hard for you to sell them in a fresh market. So that's the key damage that thrips inflict, and hopefully this will help you see that it's pretty diagnostic. The caterpillars and flea beetles are not going to inflict this kind of damage to your crucifer crops. So just a few close-ups of thrips. They're tiny. They can range from pale white to yellow or brown in color. That varies a little bit with life stage, but also species. The adults have wings, so I didn't have a really nice high-resolution image of an adult, but just wanted you to know the adults do have wings. The immatures do not. So we see a first stage nymph here, and then the second stage nymph, and then they'll go on to the adult stage. So these are the two kind of immature stages. And again, this is magnified here from a collared leaf. This is what they actually look like if you could see them up close. So magnification is really going to help, and may even be necessary for you to really see the thrips. And they may be feeding on the underside of leaves or the top side of leaves, but generally speaking, if you see them, they're very active. They're going to be crawling. Adults may fly off the plant if you flick the leaves. So just a little helpful tip there in terms of looking where to look and what kind of behavior you might expect from these thrips on your plants. So I'm just going to give some general tips for management for each of these insect groups, just because the feedback or the recommendations we have can be very particular. So if you have specific questions, please feel free to reach out. But generally speaking, there are some key cultural control strategies, likely that many of you are already doing, that will help you manage these insect pests on your cruciferous crops. So of course, cultivar and variety selection. For a number of reasons. We know that certain plant varieties are less sensitive or less susceptible. They may even be less attractive to certain insects. So for example, research has demonstrated that thrips prefer cabbages that have a tighter head as they're forming than looser heading cabbage varieties. And that probably has to do with the microclimate and the protection that provides these thrips. I'll also weigh in on one of the questions from Laura's talk earlier about the different varieties of onions, or varieties or cultivars of onions. Some of these plants also reflect or absorb, I guess, not sure which side of that point I'm trying to make here, but they can appear to insects differently. So they may reflect different wavelengths of UV light. And so some will appear brighter to certain insects than others. And that can be an element of the cultivar or variety selection. time planting to avoid periods of high pest activity. And depending on the pest and the crop you're working in, that may be delaying planting or maybe planting early. I'm giving an example here for flea beetles. If you're planting your crucifer seedlings out, if you can do that earlier, you're actually going to give them a better start because they'll be able to grow out of the vulnerable stage before flea beetles become active. So they have more tissue, they're larger, they can handle more feeding damage than a teeny tiny plant that may be planted at the normal time. Avoid planting the same crop in the same field year after year. So in essence, rotate crops between and among your fields if you can. And this just slows the buildup of pest populations. And I'll use flea beetles here as another example. Flea beetles tend to be more and more problematic if you plant the same crop in the same field over and over again, because they do have overwintering life stages that may stay there in that field. So they're there and ready the next year when your crop either is transplanted or emerges. The last one, and I'll just emphasize again, or re-emphasize what Laura mentioned in her earlier talk, that disking crop residue and also maintaining good weed control. These are key elements to managing insect pests in general, but certainly the ones I've talked about today. And that's because disking the crop residue is going to interrupt the life cycle. If there are soil dwelling stages, for example, you may kill them by disking up crop residue. You may eliminate a food source, and by managing your weeds, you're eliminating an important non-crop food resource that these pests may rely on before your crop is available in the field to them. General tips in terms of biological control, I'm just going to say natural enemies here. Preserving and protecting your natural enemies is very important and going to help you for managing these particular insects I mentioned today. And that's because all of these pest insects are attacked by a variety of natural parasites, predators, and pathogens. I have a picture here of a damsel bug. This is a good guy. You might be surprised how voracious they are. They can feed on caterpillars by sticking their little mouth parts in there, and they suck them dry, drag them around on the leaves. It's pretty amazing to observe. Also using reduced risk or organic insecticides will help because these are less toxic to your parasites and predators that are naturally occurring. Some examples that many of you likely are familiar with are the BTs or some of the caterpillar killing viruses that are now available for use. So I know I'm running a little over on time here. Phil, you can totally stop me if I need to make time for the next person. So I'm just gonna quickly, okay, so I see he's put a poll up here. The last thing I'll mention are some chemical control strategies. So I didn't talk about this very much, obviously, because I'm trying to cover too much about too many insects, but apply insecticides based on scouting and monitoring efforts, right? And also based on pest thresholds. So an example with seedlings of some of the crucifer crops, when you reach a threshold of 1 flea beetle per plant, that's the time to take action when they're in the seedling stage. So that's just an example of a threshold. Caterpillars are typically the most important pests to manage. I hope I've sent that message home to you. So as you're selecting insecticides, select those insecticides with the focus of managing, with the goal of managing caterpillars, but also other insects that may also be managed by the same chemistry or product. It's very important, particularly with caterpillars and thrips, to apply these products in sufficient volumes of water and achieve good coverage to get the best efficacy possible. And of course, visit the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide for some helpful recommendations and insight into which products, for example, are most damaging or most harmful to natural enemies or similar. So there's a couple of links here. So I'm just gonna move forward here. Uh-oh, if it will let me. I think that this will be recorded, so hopefully, or I can make these slides available. Let's just put it that way. I just wanted to plug the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory. You can go to their website, click this Submit a Sample button, and you'll see this other page pop up where you can submit a physical sample or a digital sample. All the instructions are there. This can be a great way to help you identify what insect pests you have. So I'll summarize there. I see you've answered the questions. I'm happy to see, despite my technical difficulties and rapid rate of speech, that this presentation has been somewhat helpful. Here's my email and my lab website. I'm happy to take any questions by email or through the chat, and I'm happy to follow up after. So sorry for running over, and thanks everyone for your patience.
Thank you. I think we have 1 minute left here before we need to move on. So couple questions on caterpillars. So with the caterpillars, they said they've not seen the cross-striped one. Would the management for that caterpillar be any different on those crops and those other ones they have seen?
Great question. No, I mean, most of the insecticides are going to manage caterpillars well, are going to manage them all pretty well. So some of the exceptions are things like the diamondback moth, which is a really tiny caterpillar. It can be hard to reach it because of where it is on the plant, like inside a cabbage head or down in the nooks of kale or something like that. But that is kind of unique to that particular insect. As long as you get good coverage and use a product that works well against caterpillars, it's going to hit the cross-striped caterpillar as well.
One other question with the diamondback moths, have you seen any insect resistance to insecticides with those?
That's a good question. I believe that is a caterpillar among many potentially that are exhibiting some resistance. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but I would not be surprised if that were the case. I don't know if Laura knows or if others want to weigh in, but now I have to say I'm not certain.
They are one of the first to exhibit resistance to BT, but I'm not sure that that has spread to our region yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Phil. I appreciate it. If more people have questions, would you mind answering them in chat, Elizabeth?
Sure.
Thank you. Could you stop sharing your screen?
Okay.
Perfect. I would like to introduce, thank you. I would like to introduce Petrus and Wenjing, and they're going to talk about indoor and field production of specialty melons. If you want to start sharing your screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Oh, and there's a whole question up. Can you see my screen? Oh.
Yep, you're just not in sharing yet, the slideshow.
There we go.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. Today we will be talking about indoor and field production of specialty melons. I am Petrus Langenhoven with the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, and Wenjing Guan from the same department will be speaking after me. I will be mainly talking about some of our experiences in high tunnels, and she will address some of the experiences we had out in the field. A little bit of history as to why we actually went into this direction in terms of vertical high tunnel production of specialty melons. A little bit of background: Indiana is one of the largest producers of melons in the country. We ranked 5th in value and 6th in production, and I think all Hoosiers know the melons that we can buy in July from Indiana growers. Although we did lose a lot of acreage since 1997, we're down to about 1,800 acres currently, and a lot of that, about 33% of that, was lost just during the 2011-2012 foodborne illness, the Listeria outbreak that we experienced. And that made me think a little bit about, how can we stretch production throughout the state. Mainly production is happening in the southwestern part of the state, where we have more sandy soils, and they also can come into production a lot earlier than the central and northern part of the state. And high tunnels came to mind. And the other thing we can do with high tunnels is we can terrace a crop in a high tunnel, so we can increase planting density. A lot of research was done in the US by Dr. Daniel Cantliff from the University of Florida many years ago, and he found it to be quite lucrative in Florida. It's not only a phenomenon here in the US, but countries like Morocco and other North African countries and Southern European countries actually trellis melons vertically in the greenhouse, thereby getting this very good looking high quality fruit. And that made us think of submitting a grant to investigate this. some of the opportunities for growing specialty melons indoors or outside is that they are really of superior quality, very interesting aromas, very interesting flavors, and most often quite a lot sweeter than the standard melons that we find in the market. And I have noticed this past season in Payless that there was a wider variety of specialty melons on the shelf, and consumers hopefully tapped into that. But a lot of the melons that we have tried, we haven't seen on the shelf here or at farmers markets yet. There's a lot of diversity when it comes to specialty melons, and you can cater to a lot of different palates and preferences from the consumer side in that sense. This is a typical setup. This is one of our tunnels at Vincennes at the Southwest Pack Research Center. In 2019, we have tested varieties actually from 2018, but 2019 we had quite a bit of varieties in there. We were just trying to play around and see which varieties really do well. Some varieties doesn't perform well in the high tunnel. It's like they just cannot, get to that sugar level, Brix level that you want them to be at, which should be at least 10 or higher. Some of them are getting soft towards maturity inside the high tunnel. So it was important for us to go through several iterations of varieties to see which ones work and which doesn't work. So we have added some of the standards like the Astound and Accolade that you see in field production in Indiana, although those varieties are bearing quite large fruit, and it's not really ideal for trellising in a high tunnel. Other cantaloupes like Bitter Gold and Sugar Cube, much smaller. I think Sugar Cube is pretty common and well known among market gardeners. We tried some Tuscan, Gallia types. The Snow Leopard is very interesting. Got a few pictures later on. Shiba, and you can go on with the list. Some Hammy types, which came from Taiwan. Well, Taiwanese companies developing them and selling them here in the States. Some Yellow Canaries, Sweet and Sour Melon, which Wenjing will also talk a little bit more about later on. The Peel de Sapos, Ananas, Turkish, Korean. So many different types, so many different flesh colors. They might slip or not slip, and different maturity dates. So just a wide variety of types and different specialty melons that we looked at. So we had two locations, Lafayette and West Lafayette. Production conditions differed a little bit inside the tunnel. Tunnel sizes were slightly off. This one was 28 by 48 feet. We had to use two of those. And in Vincennes, we had a 30 by 96 feet tunnel. And that changed the plant population a little bit. Although we were still, if you compare that to field planting populations, which is around 2,904 plants to the acre, we were about 2.25 times higher here and 2.5 times higher at the Vincennes location in terms of plant density. Conditions was also a little bit different. We had louver vents in Lafayette. We had roll-up windows, but we had insect exclusion netting on. As you probably know, one of the bigger pests, and Laura have spoken about this in the previous webinar, is the cucumber beetles, and the exclusion netting really helped to keep them out and keep the crop healthy. We had roll-up windows and a ridge vent in the southwestern part of the state. No insect exclusion netting. The pressure of the beetles was just not that high there, and we could get away with that and still maintain good yields. Soils differed a little bit, but we tried to amend our fertility program according to the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. This is what it looked like inside the tunnel. We had black and white weed barrier in the aisles. In Lafayette, we had these open areas where we planted in. The drip line is put down along that as well. We used trellis netting. We also used trellis netting down in Vincennes, although we actually had a plastic mulch on top of the bed there. This is a little bit older stage of the melon. And some melons, if you don't catch them quick enough, you might harvest in the morning, especially if it's a slip type, and you get there by the afternoon, the melon will be on the ground. So some melons require that you actually bag them, and obviously that is a concern in the sense of it adds labor to whatever you do. In terms of trellising, you would trellis the main stem all the way to the top of the trellis net. Obviously there are laterals coming out of every node, and these laterals will have to be controlled. We cleaned up about 18 inches of the stem at the bottom of the plant, cleaned all the laterals off. Then we would wait until the fruit sets on that, on a specific lateral, and when fruit starts to set, you would take one lateral out. You would leave one, take one out, leave one, take one out, if that is the sequence that allows you just to stretch production a little bit on the plant and give the plant to time to recover and be able to grow each melon into full size. What we also do with the lateral itself is we will leave one leaf, maybe sometimes two leaves after the set fruit, and then we will nip the lateral there, terminate that bud, and so that it doesn't grow any further. Otherwise, it just becomes an entire large bush in the tunnel, and ventilation is hampered through that. Bumblebees were used to pollinate, very important. Otherwise, especially when you use insect exclusion netting, otherwise you're not going to get any pollination in there. Even in the open tunnel, in one sense, it proved to be very helpful to get the bumblebees in there to do the work. So let's see what some of the varieties did. I just selected some of the ones that I think is actually pretty useful, that we potentially could push into high tunnel production. You can see we were aiming for varieties that had fruit between 2 and 4 pounds. I think that's a nice size personalized melon. Although you can see Melon and Full Moon, they produce slightly larger fruit. But these varieties are so interesting that I think we were willing to actually keep them included in the evaluations. And the yields are pretty good. I mean, if you compare to open field yields of Astound or Accolade, which is probably around 32,000 pounds, 35,000 pounds to the acre, these yields are pretty good. What we have found with some of these varieties is that actually just by increasing the plant density in the tunnel, we got the increase in yield. It wasn't that there was more fruit on the plant. A variety like Torpedo or something like Apollo, which I didn't put the data on here, it's a very small Korean type melon, and they are very prolific. 5, 6 fruit on the plant is not uncommon when you produce those. Bitter Gold, very nice, very firm variety, very nice color. It looks great. Da Vinci, the Tuscan type. Snow Leopard, which is probably one of my favorite or ultimate varieties. One thing I have to say that we'll talk a little bit about in a minute, some challenges that we experience, especially when you work with such a wide, diverse range of varieties, is that there's it's very hard to actually measure maturity, unless you work with a variety quite a while, and they don't slip. Like most of these don't actually slip. That is a problem to gauge maturity. For instance, like Snow Leopard here is very interesting. It becomes this creamy white color, and these green dots that it has on the skin actually turns a light green, and then you really know that that is good. I've tasted some fruit, and the Brix goes up all the way to 17. I think 18.1 was the highest Brix that I've ever measured with a Snow Leopard. Torpedo and Apollo, very crunchy, very thin flesh, but very crunchy, very unique flavor. I like it. Not everybody likes it. Maybe some of you know Professor Jules Janek, that was with our department. He retired at the end of last year, and he always complained to me that the varieties were too crunchy. So it's all about consumer preference in the end. This variety, I think it's either you love it or you hate it. I would always think that people like that like sour gummies would really appreciate this variety. It's a very interesting experience. The first time you eat this, you start eating the melon and it feels sweet, and immediately the sourness hits you on your palate as well. And it's just an amazing flavor. I do love it a lot, but I've seen many students that have worked with me that said, no, they don't like this at all. Amy, very nice canary type variety. So like I've mentioned, some of these challenges that we are experiencing is selecting the right varieties. I think we're getting closer to that. It's a very fast growing crop. You can get anywhere between a foot to 2 feet of growth on a weekly basis, and that requires labor to train that plant and trellis it. Like I said, maturity indices will be a challenge initially, but we try to get that sorted out so it will be easier for any grower to harvest this. Fruit handling, of course, working with smaller fruit and much more fruit, that might also be a challenge on the labor component. And other things that I think still need some work is irrigation inside a high tunnel, especially since we have grown in soil, managing the soil fertility. pH can be an issue, and I've seen it in my tunnels. pH goes up pretty quickly when you use well water in an environment where you don't get rainwater on the ground. And other threats that you have to look out for: cucumber beetle. You have to treat the seedlings in the beginning of the season. And powdery mildew, you can select for that. Some varieties are much more tolerant, and I think the varieties that we have now is pretty tolerant to powdery mildew. Of course, the big question is it profitable? You know, you have extra infrastructure, you have different supplies that you need for indoor production, and the labor component is so much higher than the outdoor production, but it might be something that is more feasible for a direct to consumer market situation. Okay, Wenjing, I'm gonna hand over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Petrus. I will share my screen. Can everyone see my screen well? Okay, I will see if I hear it. Okay, I will follow Petrus's talk and discuss our specialty melon cultivar evaluations in open field condition. So melon is a crop with extremely diverse fruit characteristics. I believe melon lovers know this. And technically, besides cantaloupe, all other melon types with different fruit attributes are generally referred as specialty melons in the United States. And we have been looking at those specialty melons for a few years at Southwest Purdue Agriculture Center. And here I want to share with you a few cultivars we think has the potential to grow in Indiana in open field condition. Petrus mentioned this one, sugar cube, and I believe many of you, if you have been trying or heard about specialty melons, maybe heard about this variety. It's a very popular cultivar grown by small and diversified farms. And it is a cantaloupe, but the uniqueness of this cultivar is its size, only a little bit larger than a large football, a perfect size for one-person consumption. However, when we compare sugar cube with melon types together, when we grow them in open field, we do notice sugar cube stand out by its very high sugar content. Its flesh is similar to Eastern type cantaloupe. But if we look at the yield here, that is the yield by weight. Actually, sugar cube ranked at the bottom in 2020 in our evaluation. So the yield by weight of this variety is not that good. But for the if you have the market, like consumers is willing to pay like $2 or $3 for one of the small, extremely sweet cantaloupes, I do believe sugar cube can be a very promising cultivar to grow. And it's growing very well in our open field condition. Even past the year, we have extremely large rainfall during the middle of the harvest. This sugar content is still stays high for this variety, although we have that big rainfalls. But a difference I do notice the last year, a little bit different than previous years, is the fruit size of the variety grown quite big. So you can see this 2019, the average fruit size we have is about 2 pounds. And in 2020, in the year we have a lot of rainfalls in the harvest season, the average fruit size is 3 pounds. So that is something about sugar cube, this variety. Next one, also Petrus mentioned, did very well in the high tunnels, slow leopard. It also did very well in the open field. And the average fruit weight is about 2 to 3 pounds per fruit. Also small size fruit. Each plant produces 5 to 6 melons. And another thing for slow leopard is it have a long harvest window. Slow leopard is very similar to honeydews. But we tend to start harvest honeydew melons about 2 weeks after we harvest cantaloupe. However, slow leapers can be harvested almost as early as honeydew melons. So that's another advantage of slow leopard. The sugar content is pretty good. And as Petrus mentioned, it's a little tricky to decide when is the ideal time to harvest the slow leopard, as well as all the other long slip melons. So specifically for slow leopard, we do notice these melons have those green specks, stripes on the creamy yellow background. But when the melon is close to ripe, those green specks is sometimes will turn very light green or even yellowish color. That is the time we know it's reached the highest quality. And you can see this figure, that is the yield by weight. As again, be noticed, this is the yield by weight. Those slow leopard is kind of low compared to a lot of other varieties. I think the main reason is the fruit size is small. But if we look at the fruit size, it's one of the top melons. And then look at the green area and the orange area. The orange areas are cow fruit, and the blue area is the marketable fruit. You can see that slow leopard, almost all the fruit we harvest have a high quality, very high marketability. So that's a very nice aspect of this variety. The next one I want to mention is canary melon. Canary melon have very vivid white, a very vivid bright yellow skin. And the internal of the fruit is similar to honeydew melon. We evaluated 2 canary melons in 2019. One is Army, another is Brilliant. Both performed similarly. Brilliant is a little bit larger than Army. Comparing with other melon types, canary melon yield ranked about in the middle. Each plant produced 2 to 3 fruit, relatively high breaks. I think the unique external color, good quality, and the high marketable rate of canary melons can be an attraction for consumers. I did hear a success story from farmers I work with. They grow canary melons and sell at farmers market. He told me his consumers just love this melon because they cannot find it anywhere in the other market. And also this melon is relatively easy to grow as most of the honeydew melons in my experience. Okay, now next I want to mention is 2 melons that were actually ranked on top of the yield in our 2 years evaluation. One is called Golden Crush. This is the highest yield variety in 2019. A long slip muskmelon. Average fruit weight is about 4.8 pounds, slightly smaller than aconite, like the commonly grown eastern cantaloupe. Ripeness of golden crush is determined by golden yellow external fruit color. Flesh of golden crush is orange and firmer compared to eastern cantaloupe. And sugar content of this melon ranks about in the middle of all the cultivars we evaluated. In 2020s, as I mentioned, we have big rains. We did notice the melon cracks as shown in this picture. And this results in a relatively higher rate of unmarketable fruit of this variety.
Wenjing,
Yeah.
I feel bad to interrupt you because we could learn so much, but we are already at our time limit to have a sponsor break, and I want to think about the people coming after. So I'm so sorry to have to stop. Would you mind answering questions if people have any in the chat, if they do have questions?
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share with Lori, and she can share with our sponsor break. Okay. We'll come back in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wenjing, would you mind stop share your screen, and that way Lori can share hers.
I thought you can stop share. Okay, I just stopped share.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bayhorse Gold Pumpkin has quickly become a grower favorite. Farm markets love the dark orange fruit, its ideal ribbing, and sturdy handle. Commercial growers like the consistent fruit size and shape and yield, which helps them pack out their 40-count bins. Throw in powdery mildew tolerance that protects the crop and yield, and it's easy to see why growers have become Bayhorse fans. Visit rupseeds.com or call 800-700-1199 to learn more. There's nothing quite like fresh, sweet and buttery sweet corn. With over 100 varieties to select from, Rupp Seeds can help you grow perfect ears for your customers. If you need a cold soil tolerant variety to hit the early market, one that will stand up to shipping, or one with great flavor that will keep your customers wanting more, our team can help you put together a plan to produce great sweet corn all season long. Visit ruppseeds.com or call 800-700-1199 to learn more.
For over 85 years, Norse Farms has produced and sold premium quality small fruit plants to national and international commercial fruit growers, home gardeners, and resellers. We're committed to providing customers with virus-indexed, highly productive plants. This commitment drives us to stay on the cutting edge of the latest developments in the industry. We identify and test new varieties and growing techniques so that we can stand behind our promise to deliver quality to you. From our on-site lab to our greenhouse, our fields to our packing house, our _1 priority is to ensure that you get the best plants possible. For more information about Norse Farms, visit us at norsefarms.com. Whether you're an experienced
Hello, my name is Brandon Lean, and I am the Deputy of Community Development Programs for Pathstone, Indiana. Pathstone builds family and individual self-sufficiency by strengthening farm worker, rural, and urban communities. Pathstone promotes social justice through programs and advocacy. Pathstone offers a great on-farm housing rehab program to help Indiana growers improve and maintain their on-farm housing. Indiana growers can receive up to $2,000 of matched funds for rehab projects. Indiana farmers, growers, and community groups seeking to substantially renovate or construct housing for farm workers are also eligible for technical assistance free of charge. You can contact me, Brandon Lean, at 765-286-2162 or BLIEN@pathstone.org. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Lori, for that. We're going to get started here again. We're going to, Liz Maynard's going to talk about potassium in vegetable production here. So, Liz, you can get started.
Okay, thank you, Phil. And I think there's a poll question if you'd like to go ahead and get started with that poll question. Okay, you seeing the slideshow there?
Yes.
Wonderful.
That's good.
So next week, there are going to be some talks on soil health and on soil tests for nutrients. But today I really wanted to zero in, or this talk is really going to zero in on the potassium part of the chemical aspect of soil health. And certainly those talks next week will have information useful for understanding potassium and how to manage it for vegetable production. This topic came to my mind because it seemed to me there were more questions than usual about potassium that came up this year, came into my inbox. So I thought it might make sense to go through and do a review of what's the role of potassium in the plant, what's potassium like in the soil, how do you get potassium to the plant so that you can get the yield and the quality of vegetables that you need. So potassium is a macronutrient, meaning plants need it in fairly large amounts. And if you look at the total dry weight of the plant, potassium might be as much as 5% of the entire plant. If you compare it to the other macronutrients, it's second in relation to nitrogen for the amount that's needed in most plants. So it's quite important. The get my motion here. So in the plant, potassium is a positively charged ion. So we write it K, that's the chemical symbol for potassium with a plus, meaning it's positively charged. And it's involved in a lot of important functions, as you might imagine. Water relations, keeping the electrical charge in the plant balanced, moving compounds through the xylem, other nutrients like nitrate, phosphate, magnesium, and calcium, and then moving the products of photosynthesis to around the plant to fruits, down into the tubers and roots of storage roots like for potatoes and sweet potatoes. It's involved in activating enzymes throughout the plant and involved in synthesizing compounds like ATP, an energy compound, involved in synthesizing cellulose, which is in the cell walls that keeps the cells strong. So it has a lot of important functions. So I see we have their answers to the poll. And I don't know how to get them out of the middle of my screen, maybe, but that's fine.
Liz, you should just be able to drag it away so that it's not in front of your presentation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Plants take up potassium also just as that positive cation, positively charged molecules of potassium. It's taken up by the roots and it requires energy and oxygen. So if your plant is not photosynthesizing, it doesn't have much energy to do its work, won't be able to take up very much. And if your soil is waterlogged, there's not oxygen in the soil, you won't be able to take it up. It also requires that the plant export hydrogen to take up potassium, and so sometimes in very low pH soils that can inhibit potassium uptake. At a high crop demand, you may be looking at the plant absorbing 3 or 4 pounds of potassium per acre per day, and oftentimes that peak demand will be during fruit development in something like a tomato or cantaloupe, or as the roots are filling in something like a crop with storage roots like a sweet potato. The graph on the right here shows the uptake of potassium in a tomato plant, and it basically follows the size of the plant. But the other thing this shows is where that potassium is going in the plant. The dark circles are the percent of the potassium that's in the leaves, and that percent decreases because as the fruit grows, much of the potassium in the plant is in the fruit. And that would be true for many of our fruiting vegetable crops. If you don't have enough potassium in the plant, of course, you're likely to see some deficiency symptoms. And typically, because potassium can move in the plant from older leaves to newer leaves, you'll see deficiency symptoms first in older leaves or leaves where there's a high demand, like if there's a leaf right below a tomato cluster, you might see some deficiency symptoms in there. It starts with a light green or yellowing around the edge, the margin of the leaf, and at the tip of the leaf. That will move on to turning brown and dead, and it can move inwards in between the veins of the leaf. You also are more likely to see weak stems because of the involvement of potassium in cellulose, in making cellulose. And then we know that we often see fruit color issues in tomatoes, yellow shoulders, internal white tissue if we don't have enough potassium. You can also have fruit flavor issues in things like tomatoes, muskmelons, because you need that potassium to get the flavor compounds into the fruits. realizing that these negative effects occur before you can even see the visual symptoms, of course. So it's important to have enough potassium there that you don't see these symptoms. If you see these symptoms, you're already a bit behind the 8-ball. In the soil, potassium is, most of the potassium in the soil is in forms that aren't available to plants, in minerals, part of the rocks, like in feldspar or mica. Now, in the long term, weathering will release that potassium, but in the short term, that is just not available to plants. You'll also find potassium in clay, where you have soils with a lot of clay or with some clay. The potassium can get stuck between the layers of that clay, and clays can fix quite a bit of potassium. That's called non-exchangeable potassium. It can slowly become available to plants, but it's not readily available. And if you're applying fertilizer to a soil with a lot of clay, if you're applying a potassium source to soils with clay, some of that fertilizer will get bound into the clay lattice and not be available to the plant. So you often see higher amounts of potassium needed on high cation exchange capacity soil where you have clays. The two other places you'll find potassium in the soil are on the soil colloids, on those cation exchange sites. The potassium is adsorbed there. It can exchange beyond that site and then go into solution. The potassium that's on those soil colloids and in solution, that is available to the plant. And if you measure all the potassium in the plant, I mean, in the soil, it might be from 0.5 to 25 tons per acre, depending on the soil. Only about 1/10 to 2% of that is in that readily available form. So, as the plant is taking up potassium, it can take it up fast enough that the potassium right around the roots on colloids and in solution, that it uses up the potassium that's right close to the roots. In order for those roots to take up more, you have to have potassium diffusing back in there. And the rate of that diffusion will depend on how much potassium is in the soil, in neighboring soil on colloids, in solution, and to some extent in the clay lattices. So it's important to keep a lot of potassium in those available pools so that the roots will have access to it when they need it. Potassium, particularly in sandy soils, can leach fairly readily. It doesn't leach as readily as something like nitrate, but it can leach, especially in low cation exchange capacity soils. You might have as much as I think it was like 100 pounds per acre a year leaching if there was no crop there, or maybe 30% of the potassium. So things that can increase the rate of diffusion are when the soil warms up and when there's good soil moisture. So those are things to think of as you want to make sure that potassium is near the roots where the plant can take it up. Okay, I did mention the diffusion. There are some other interactions with other nutrients that are important to realize. Potassium has a positive charge, and other positively charged nutrients can influence potassium uptake because the plant can only have so much. It has to balance its electrical charge. So, and I'll talk a little about this a little bit more, but especially with relation to magnesium. But if you have high levels of magnesium, calcium, or sodium, that could inhibit the potassium uptake, in some cases with ammonium also. I want to mention just a little bit of potassium math here. I've been used the abbreviation K to refer to potassium, and that's commonly used. But when people start talking about fertilizers, the convention is often to report potassium as potassium oxide, or K2O. And if you look at a fertilizer label and see it's labeled like 0060, well, that means 0% nitrogen, 0% phosphate, 60% potassium as potassium oxide equivalent, or as K2O equivalent. And when we're talking about how much fertilizer to apply, how much potassium to apply as a fertilizer, that is also usually given in pounds of K2O per acre or per 1,000 square feet. So I wanted to make you aware of that. You can convert from K2O to K with the formulas that you see here. The point I want to make is if you're looking up information about potassium, if you're talking to someone about it, if you're looking at recommendations, understand whether someone is talking about K or K2O, so you'll know you'll be getting the proper numbers. So, so we know we need to have potassium in the soil. The weathering of the rocks in the soil is not going to supply us enough to replace what we take out in the crops. So we'll need to add some sort of fertilizer. This is a wide range of potassium sources, and the information we have on this table is the source, the percent K2O there, how much of that K2O is readily available, and then over here some information about the salt index of the fertilizers. The first four items here are common sources of potassium in fertilizers. We have potassium chloride is 60% potash, potassium sulfate 48%, potassium nitrate 44% the potash, and it also has nitrate, and then potassium magnesium sulfate at 22%. All of these have readily available potassium. The salt index varies in them. And the salt index is important if you have a soil that's likely to be too salty and so injure your crops or prevent inhibit seed germination through a high salt index, high salinity. And I have two columns here. One is the salt index for the product itself, and the other is the partial salt index, which is for based on the same amount of K2O. And so what that means is if you were applying the same amount of potassium from these four fertilizers, the potassium sulfate would have the lowest salt index, so it would be adding the least salt for that amount of potassium. Potassium nitrate would be the next, and then the potassium chloride and potassium magnesium sulfate would be similar. If you measure the EC in your soil and it's up to 2.5 decicentimeters per centimeter or so, that's getting to the level where you might be seeing a detriment to the crop from a high salt index. So you might want to be especially careful at using some of the saltier products in those situations. The other potassium sources here are ones that we might not think of fertilizers, but if you're adding those to your soil, they are adding potassium, and that's something to be aware of. Manures, dehydrated or fresh or composted, plant-based compost, all will have potassium, and that will be readily available. You see wood ashes here, 10% potassium. That's pretty good. It's readily available. Wood ashes, though, have a high pH, and they will raise the pH of your soil. It's a good source of potassium, but be aware to monitor the pH so you don't get it out of range. Last two products here are both minerals or rocks, finely ground rocks, and the potassium is not available. Those need to be further weathered in order for that potassium to slowly become available. So these materials can be are available in different formulations, different types of products. And on the next few slides, I have pictures of a few examples of those products. I wanted to show some examples of organic potassium fertilizers. Here's a sulfate of potash or potassium sulfate, potassium magnesium sulfate. Both of these say they're solution grade, so that they could be mixed in a solution and applied through an irrigation system if you wanted. A couple other, here's another potassium sulfate. Some potassium formulations are also available that are also include nitrogen and phosphorus. Often these are manure based or byproduct of livestock or meat production. If you are doing certified organic production, of course you want to check that the OMRI certificate for these products is current, and check with your certifier to make sure that the products are okay in your certification system. Another type of fertilizer that I wanted to show a few examples of were some liquid-based fertilizers. There's this Nutri-K, which has 24% potassium in it. Calibrate has a little bit of nitrogen and 10% potash. And then this product here, it's called Organic Liquid, has 4% potash and sulfur. That says organic. I'm not sure it has an OMRI certificate, so that would be something to double check if you're looking at certified. So which fertilizer should you choose? it's they will all supply potassium, and I think the things are the one that's going to be right in your operation is going to vary depending on the price, the availability, how you want to apply it. Are you going to be applying to the soil that you'll then work in? Do you want something that solid that you can mix up into a solution and apply through a drip irrigation? Do you want something that's already mixed up and sold as a liquid? All of those are things to consider in picking the one that's going to be best for you. The table here is an example of the variation in price per unit per pound of potassium. So you can see if you're buying a ton of potassium chloride, you're getting that potassium for like 50 cents a pound. If you're buying a 50-pound bag, you're still under $1. Potassium sulfate, 50-pound a bag, still under $1. But as you get into some of the other products, you'll be paying more than $1 per pound. This potassium sulfate granular is one that was solution grade, so it's a little higher expense. These two products here are just your typical greenhouse fertilizers that I know some people are using in fertigation systems. You're paying quite a bit more there per pound of potassium than you are if you had some of these others. So just something to be aware of. You can do these calculations for the fertilizers that you are interested in also. Where's my next slide here? Yeah, so we know where potassium is in the plant, how it is in the soil. How do we know, and some different sources of potassium, how do we know how much potassium to use? And this chart shows one way that I really like to think about it. This is showing how much potassium is removed in the harvested part of different vegetables for every ton of vegetables that you harvest. So down here at the low end, we have watermelon. 2.4 pounds of potash for every ton of watermelon that you sell. You're taking that out of your field. At the high end, there's potatoes and sweet potato, about 13 pounds for every ton of potatoes or sweet potatoes you're selling. In the middle, we have tomatoes at 7 pounds per ton. So what that means is that you're taking that potassium, if you're selling those vegetables, you're taking that potassium out of your soil and selling it to someone else. If you want to keep enough potassium in your soil, you have to add at least that much back in, right? The weathering of the potassium doesn't happen fast enough to replace all of that. This next slide has the same graph, but in terms of pounds of potassium for 100 pounds of vegetables, if you're not thinking in terms of tons. And here, just for example, for tomatoes, if you harvest 100 pounds of tomatoes, those would have just about a third a pound, a little over a third of a pound potassium in them. So that gives you an idea of how much you have to put back in that area of your field or structure. Whoops, skipped a slide. So that's kind of the background for, or one useful bit of information to have as you think about how much potassium do you need to apply. With any nutrient, but particularly with, for instance, with potassium, one approach is to maintain the soil level at a moderate amount where you can get a good yield. There's enough potassium in there to get the yield and the quality that you want. And if you can maintain it at that amount, then every year you just put in what's removed by your crop. And that's what I showed you at the previous graphs. So as an example, what's a moderate amount of potassium? Well, work in the Midwest has suggested that if you have a low cation exchange capacity, 85 to 135 parts per million in your soil test, higher cation exchange capacity up to 165, that's probably in the moderate range for most vegetables. And if you have those levels, you just need a maintenance application, which you would calculate by figuring out how much your crop is removing. Another important thing about applying potassium is it needs to be there in the ground before the crop needs it. If you get behind on potassium, it can be difficult to catch up. So you can broadcast it and move it into the root zone with tillage or with the irrigation. You can ban smaller amounts at planting, apply small amounts in transplant water. You can incorporate it into a plastic mulch beds, and that will be a little bit more efficient since you're not fertilizing in between the beds. Generally, it's recommended not to apply more than 300 pounds potassium per acre at one time. So if your calculation is that you need more than that, you might want to apply some of that before planting and then apply the rest in drip irrigation or in a second application during the season. I think that's it. Or if you are on a very sandy soil where potassium is likely to leach, it can make sense to split it in more than one application. I mentioned that in some high magnesium soils, magnesium can interfere with potassium uptake. So there are ways you can look into that in more detail that I have here, but I think since we're a little bit short on time, I won't really go into this. But be aware that if you have been using dolomitic lime, or if you are in a high tunnel where you've been irrigating with hard water that has a lot of magnesium and calcium, you may very well have enough magnesium in the soil to interfere with potassium uptake. And then the levels of potassium that you will need will be a little bit higher. Let's see, I think on this slide, I wanted to give an example of how to calculate potassium amounts if you were using a solution like in a high tunnel. I realize we're getting a little out of time here. So I can, I have the next slide where I've blocked some things out. And I think what I'd like to say is I will, if we're short on time, maybe Phil can nod. Should I wrap it up? If people need this information, feel free to contact me and I will share it with you. The final thing that I'd like to say is, if I can get this out of, well, is that to monitor, it's really important to monitor your crop with tissue testing during the season so that you know that the potassium you put on is getting into the plant and you're not going to be seeing deficiencies later on. So I would really encourage you to monitor the crop with regular tissue testing. So that is great. I appreciate your time. I see people want more information, and I think the next question is about if you said you wanted more information, you have an opportunity to say what information you want, and I think Lais will show a word cloud, and I will take that down and get more of that information out to you.
Yes, and you have time to still share in the word cloud even when the next presenter starts. So thank you so much, Dr. Maynard. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much.
So our next people will be about produce safety, actually. Dr. Amanda Deering is here, and I think Scott Monroe, and they're going to be talking about food safety for fresh produce update. So I'll stop sharing my screen so you can then share yours.
All right, thanks, Lais. So let me share my screen here. So there's a couple of poll questions. Why did I not see that?
Do you see your poll questions, Amanda?
Yes, I did.
Okay, cool.
Perfect. Here we go. How's that looking?
Looks great.
Awesome. All right, so my name is Amanda Deering, as Lais said, and we're going to talk a little bit about produce safety and kind of just an overview of what we've been offering throughout 2020 and 2021. So I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of those topics. And at the end, I'm going to ask you a couple more poll questions to answer, if you would, please. That would be very much appreciated. So Purdue is part of the Safe Produce Indiana team. And what this is a partnership between the Indiana State Department of Ag, the Indiana Department of Health, and Purdue Extension. As we formed this in 2016, and really as a group that came together, we each have a different mission. And so the regulatory side of this produce safety rule, which I'll talk about in just a second, that's overseen by the Indiana Department of Health. We have the outreach side that's held by Terry Gary with the Department of Ag. And then of course the education component is Purdue Extension. And so really what our goal of this was to implement the produce safety rule in Indiana, but also at the same time provide technical assistance to our produce growers. And so, like I said, we started this in 2016, and we've been, every year, I think we develop some new materials and things to keep evolving. But to date, we've reached approximately 12,000 growers, food processors, and consumers. And a lot of this is we do a lot of outreach. And so you'll see us at the Indiana State Fair. You see us at Hort Congress, Small Farms Conference, you name it. So we try to be very visible, and we try to be there to help people and help answer those questions that we know are there. Oops. All right, so the produce safety rule, just a quick overview. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this, but the produce safety rule was passed in 2014. And really what this was the first time we had minimal federal standards for the growing, harvest, packing, or holding of fresh produce. So before that, there was really no regulation regarding produce. So when the Food Safety Modernization Act came about, it not just touched on produce, it touched on pretty much all foods for both humans and animals and how they're produced and sold in the US. So again, these are just the minimum standards for growing produce and selling produce in the US. So really what this did, so in the past we had a very reactive approach to an outbreak. So an outbreak is when 2 or more people get sick from a bacterium, virus, things like that. And so we would respond to that. So then we try to figure out what happened, how it happened, try to clean it up, recall that product, things like that. But now with the produce safety rule and all of FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, it's really trying to prevent that illness from happening in the first place. So there's like a line up there. I don't know what that is. Maybe I did it. In Indiana, we were fortunate enough, so the states could have the option to actually adopt the rule and be the regulatory component. So if the states didn't adopt that, then it would be the Food and Drug Administration who would be the regulatory body. So luckily, I always tell growers, we were so fortunate in Indiana that we do have, so it's Indiana inspectors inspecting our produce fields. So we don't have people coming from FDA who are not familiar with Indiana farms. So I think we were very fortunate in that regard. So in 2020, so again, 2020 was a weird year. We pretty much were shut down from March to July for extension, but we managed to squeak in some of these Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings, and these basically are the good ag practices, so good agricultural practices trainings, where they also sprinkle in all the FSMA and the produce safety rule information. So right now, that's the only curriculum that's approved by FDA. So if you are covered by the produce safety rule, you have to take that training. And since that's the only one the FDA has approved, we decided to just go with that. And so as a state, we decided to do that. So that's the only one that Purdue offers. I'm going to talk a little bit about our Purdue Extension Food Safety Training Hub in a second, but we also started using that in 2020. And then in 2021, we're continuing trainings. And I'll show you how you can get to our website if you're interested in taking a training. But we're offering 7 in-person and 2 remote. And the reason that we've been doing in-person is we know a lot of our stakeholders have trouble accessing internet or have issues with stable internet. So we felt making sure that we had these in-person trainings were really important. But we also realized that remote is good for people too, so we're offering that as well. We're offering several in-person and remote refresher, we're calling them refresher courses. And basically, it's a 4-hour time period that we're going to review some of the more difficult material in the produce safety rule, but then also a time for growers to ask questions. So this would be for people who have already taken the Produce Safety Alliance grower training course and just want to come and have, have questions and get a refresher. We're also offering a 2-hour basic food safety practices for growers. So it's basic good ag practices. And this would be a 2-hour delivery that's all remote. And so again, I'll show you how you can access those on our website. So our trainings, yes, they look different. So we've had to follow all the social distancing and wear masks, and but we're still reaching growers. So it looks a little different. And so we kind of I have people that say how thankful they are that we're doing in person and how much they appreciate it. And then I also get on the other side, why are you offering an in-person class in the middle of a pandemic, which I get, but that's why we've offered these options for growers. We also do private trainings. So if you can get 3 or more growers in a room and you provide the space, we come to you and we have our projectors and screens, and we can tailor a training to your specific needs. So we've been doing actually a lot of these this year and through 2020. And I like them because, again, we can really tailor a lot of the information to that specific operation or group of growers. And so to me, it's helpful. We also will do farm visits. So if you have questions about the produce safety rule, or you just want to say, hey, am I doing the right thing? We come out and take a look around and we'll let you know. And so you just can schedule that with Scott, Terry, or I. And yeah, we just come out, spend however long you need to spend. We'll take a look. We can look at records. We can just as anything you want. This is just a very informal educational visit. So the other thing that we do offer, which is more formal, is this on-farm readiness review. And so ISDA, Department of Ag, is leading this effort, but it's really all 3 of us. And so what this is a more formal, we come to your farm and look to see if you are compliant with the produce safety rule of FSMA. This is purely educational, right? So we're just coming out, we'll go through, see if you're covered, we'll look at your records. So this is really tailored to if you have questions of if you're covered by the produce safety rule and if you're compliant. So whereas the other one is more informal, can really be about anything that you're interested in. So we completed 14 of these in 2020, and there's no cost to do these. And I'll give you a little bit more info on these. So with these on-farm readiness reviews, basically they can't be more than 3 hours. And I would say typically we're probably in the 2-hour range. And so usually it's all 3 of us. It'll be usually Scott or I, Terry from the Department of Ag, and then someone from the Department of Health. And you pick the date and time, right? So you tell us what are some good times for you, and we go from there, and we go around your schedule. So it's totally up to you. You don't have to be harvesting when you schedule one of these, but I'll tell you, you'll get much better information. So the more things that you're doing, like, so to do an OFR right now probably isn't going to be that valuable to you. It's still good. I mean, we could still do it, but really the most value you're going to get is if you are getting, even if you are harvesting, or you're getting pretty close to harvest, so that we can see all of that operation and look at your records and things like that. So the more you're doing, the better. And I know it's hard to schedule things when you are that busy. But again, we'll work with your schedule. So you decide, a day and time that works for you. So we take no pictures when we're there. We just merely, we may take notes as we're going along, but everything stays with you. And so at the end, what will happen is you'll get 3 recommendations, things to improve. And then that's really where Scott and I come in and can help you with those recommendations. So I don't know, I think it's beneficial, and we'll give you contact information at the end too, if you want to schedule one of these, but I think it's worth it. I really do. All right, so in November 2019, we opened the Purdue Extension Food Safety Training Hub, and this is located in the new Agricultural Center building in Vincennes, Indiana, at Vincennes University. So I should have mentioned before, if you don't know, Scott's he's located down south. I'm up on campus, but between the 2 of us, we work the whole state. And so we were fortunate enough to get funds for this, and we're able to develop basically this post-harvest room. So we have a little over 7,000 square feet devoted to food safety. And you can see we have a classroom, this large post-harvest room where we have a lot of equipment in there I'll talk about in a sec. An AV room where we can record videos. We also have a lab in there. So part of what we do is try to do experiments to better understand some of these bacterial pathogens and how they interact with plants and to reduce contamination. So we have that ability there as well. So most of what we usually do has been on campus, but now this gives us an additional resource. And so this is just some of the equipment that we have here. Like I said, a lot of it is going to be all related to post-harvest. And no, I typically don't dress up before I'm going to wash some apples, but this is just a picture from the, we had the opening ceremony at the hub. So we had some growers attend. It was a pretty good event. But anyway, you can see those are all the things that we have. And this is mostly all focused on the post-harvest side. So we have the washing lines, grading tables. You can see over on the other side all the different things we have. And so part of it is to do trainings where we can really show you how to clean and sanitize equipment. Another part is if you have questions about equipment you want to try out before you make that investment, you can do it there. And just gives us opportunities to use some of this equipment for research purposes as well. And so we can do some experiments, like I said, to have a better understanding of what some of these bacterial and plant interactions are. So how can you reach us? So that is our website. You can click on that. So it's just safeproducein.com. We have a lot of resources out there. So you'll see if you're interested in taking any of those trainings that I talked about, there's a registration tab up at the top. So you can register for any of those trainings. We also are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So Terry from the Department of Ag runs all of our social media. So if you're interested, you can sign up, like those things. And, like she will always say, she puts things out about once a week. We don't try to bombard you with emails or anything like that. But we do, like, if you try to keep you up to date, or if there's a late breaking situation or big news, we're going to put that out there for you guys. We also have ISD developed a quarterly newsletter that they launched in 2020. And so this has been another good resource that we can reach growers. So Terry is mainly focused on, she handles that part of it. But it's just another good resource and a way for us to stay connected. And so how we always look at it is when you take one of our trainings, it's not that we're just going to see you that one time. It's that we develop this relationship and that we're always going to be a resource for you. So we always say at our trainings, we hope we see you again, and we hope we hear from you again, because that's the whole point, is that we're here to help and trying to be the best resource that we can be. So you can call and email us. So again, so there's the poll questions I see going up. That's great. And you can call or email us. So there's my email, and like I said, I'm located on campus, but you can always just give me a call. I'm always happy to chat. There's Scott's email. So he's again located down in Vincennes in the southern part of the state. And then Terry, who's with the Department of Ag, and her information is there. So if you do want to schedule an on-farm readiness review, make sure just to call Terry or email Terry, and she can take care of you with that. So she kind of leads that effort. So if there's any questions that you have, always feel free to reach out to any one of us. So that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions, or I can
There are a few questions in the chat box, Amanda.
Okay.
So David asks, do you have any travel restrictions this year?
Well, so yes, internationally. I don't know if any of you guys know me, but I also do a lot of international extension work. I haven't been out of Indiana in almost a year, so that's been a different year. So yes, there, but no, not within Indiana. So as long as we're doing it in state, I can come to you. But I mean, I know Lace has hosted one of our trainings. We follow all the guidelines that we have to do. But if you're not comfortable doing that, we also have those 2 remote trainings.
And Terry shared the information of how they can get a hold of her in the chat. So if anyone wants to see that. Melanie says, great talk and training was great. The biggest challenge we have as a startup exempt producer is scaling ideal to our small operation. A lot of extrapolation has been involved in trying to scale solutions to comply. Yeah.
So that is one thing that I will say, and we always start our trainings out by saying that I think that curriculum, and again, we offer it because that's the only one recognized by FDA. It is geared more towards the big growers, but we always start it by saying, now we have to think about, and I think, so Melanie, I think you're completely right. You know, you have to scale everything. And sometimes some of these concepts we try to touch on, but I agree. So I think, and every operation is different. And that's part of what, you know, our challenge too, is we're teaching to a one-fits-all approach, and that's not always the case. So if you have any questions, just reach out to us, and we're happy to help you try to navigate any of those situations that you have.
Shelley asks, what kind of records do you look at?
So that's a great question. And on our website, you'll see a link and it says records required if you are covered by the produce safety rule. It should be a PDF. And those would be the records. So if you're doing the on-farm readiness review, those would be the records we would look at. And so it would be, so there's not as many, you know, that was one thing I think when the produce safety rule came about, people were, it was scary, right? Because we didn't have this regulation before. But now there's just these minimum standards. So one, for example, is a worker training record. So you have to once a year train your workers on what to do. There's a water testing requirement. You have to have those records. There's records if you use manure and that you do sanitation. And in that PDF on our website, all those records would be spelled out. And then Terry just probably saw put that in the chat. Perfect. Thank you, Terry.
And then also Vivian McCurdy shared her information too, that people can reach out to the Indiana Department of Health.
Yep, absolutely.
Does anybody have any other questions? I think Kathy Logan said, thank you for all the valuable information.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda.
Hey, you bet. And anytime you guys need anything, just feel free to reach out to any of us. We're always happy to help.
Thank you. Well, we appreciate all of you being here, and it looks like we have our last polling up to see what you thought about this session. I wanted to thank the speakers today, Dr. Laura Ingwell, Dr. Elizabeth Long, Dr. Petrus Langenhoven, Dr. Wenjing Guan. Thank you, Lori, for the sponsor information, Dr. Liz Maynard, and Dr. Amanda Deering. Thank you so much for sharing all this information with us today. Next week, we're going to be talking a lot about pesticides, and Stephen Myers will be talking about dicamba drift with emphasis on specialty crops. Wenjing Guan and Liz Maynard will be talking about understanding soil test reports. Joe Rorick will be talking about soil health diagnostics. Stephen Myers will talk about glyphosate, weed control, and controversy. And Dr. Dan Eagle will be talking about how do fungicides work. And next time is also a PARP training. If you want to attend that, I'm going to put the information in the chat so you can sign up through CVent, so you can get your PARP credits if you do that. And also, if you wanted to get CCH, make sure you put your name in the chat for Kristen that's keeping track of that. Thank you so much for being here. Does anybody have any final questions before we close? Do any of my counterparts want to share anything before we close?
The recordings of these sessions I believe, go on YouTube for people who have been asking.
That's correct.
And thank you guys for organizing. So you guys did a great job.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Rachel. Let's share that link for where you can find it on YouTube. Does anybody have that link? I found it. I'm going to share it in the chat. It's a playlist that you can look at, and we have all the past recordings. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next time. Bye.